In a world of cold, polished surfaces, the fire of rebellion is the only thing that can break the mirror of deception. Join us as we tell the stories of those who dared to defy the system and rewrite their own future. Hit subscribe now and join the cinematic revolution today.
It was 14C. I remember because I'd specifically chosen it 3 weeks earlier when I booked the ticket, aisle seat. Not too close to the bathrooms, not too close to the front. I'd done this enough times to know exactly what I wanted. Window seats sound romantic until you're trapped for 4 hours needing to use the restroom and the guy next to you is asleep with his mouth open. It was a Tuesday afternoon flight out of O'Hare, heading to Portland. I was going to see my younger sister. She'd just had her second baby and her husband was traveling for work, and she'd called me the weekend before, sounding exhausted in that specific way, that new moms sound exhausted, like they've forgotten what their own name feels like. I'd taken half a day off, packed light. Just a carry-on and my work bag, because I knew I'd probably end up answering emails from her couch anyway. The flight was about 2/3 full, the kind of load where people still hope the middle seat next to them stays empty, where you watch each person come down the aisle and silently calculate whether they're headed for you. I was doing exactly that when the man sat down in 14B. He was maybe late 40s, gray jacket, no tie. He put a laptop bag under the seat in front of him and didn't make eye contact with me. That was fine. I wasn't looking for conversation either. I had a podcast queued up and a granola bar in my bag, and I was fully prepared to mentally check out for the next 3 hours and 40 minutes. We pushed back from the gate, the usual routine. Safety demonstration, phones to airplane mode, the slow crawl toward the runway. I put my earbuds in. That's when I noticed her. The flight attendant working our section of the cabin was probably around my age, maybe a few years older. She had one of those faces that looks calm no matter what. The kind of calm that isn't absence of thought, but is actually the result of a lot of practice. She moved efficiently, checking overhead bins, adjusting things, making small talk with a few passengers near the front. She caught my eye briefly as she passed, just a glance. I looked back down at my phone. We were in the air maybe 20 minutes when she came through with the drink cart. I asked for water. She handed me a small bottle and a cup of ice, and when she set the napkin down on my tray table, she held it there just a half-second longer than necessary. I looked up. Her expression hadn't changed at all. Still that practiced calm. But she held my gaze for exactly 1 beat, then moved on to the man in 14B. I looked down at the napkin. There were words written on it in blue pen, small and neat. Please move to row 27. Leave your carry-on. Do it calmly. I read it twice. Then I looked up at the man in 14B, who was accepting his drink and nodding at something the flight attendant was saying, completely ordinary. And I looked back down at the napkin, and my first thought, I'm embarrassed to admit this, was that it was a mistake, that this napkin was meant for someone else, that there had been some kind of mix-up. My second thought was that this was some kind of prank, which made even less sense at 30,000 feet. My third thought arrived quieter than the other two, and it was the one that made my hands go still on my tray table. What if it isn't? I folded the napkin once, then again, and slipped it under my thigh. I made myself breathe normally. I took a sip of water. I stared at the seat back in front of me, and I tried to think clearly, which is harder than it sounds when your heart has just picked up speed without your permission. Leave your carry-on. That was the part that snagged on me. My carry-on had my laptop in it. My laptop had 3 years of client files, a project I was halfway through, passwords I hadn't memorized because who memorizes passwords anymore? It also had, less importantly in the grand scheme of things, the good face wash I'd specifically packed on top so I'd have it in my bag during the flight. None of that mattered, obviously. But in that moment, sitting there trying to decide whether to trust a note on a napkin from a woman I had never met, the specificity of leave your carry-on was what made me take it seriously. Because why would someone say that as part of a prank? Why would a mistake include that detail? I looked toward the back of the plane. Row 27 was visible from where I sat. Middle section, a cluster of seats that looked mostly empty. A woman with headphones, an older man asleep against the window. A gap of empty seats. I looked back at 14B. He was typing something, both hands on his keyboard, head slightly down. He hadn't looked at me since he sat down. I thought about my sister. I I thought about the baby I hadn't met yet. I thought about how my sister had sounded on the phone. I'm just so tired, I need you here. And how I'd told her I was already looking at flights. I pulled out my earbud. I picked up my water bottle. I stood up. I didn't look at 14B. I kept my face neutral, the way you do when you're trying very hard not to show that anything unusual is happening, and I walked back down the aisle. I left my carry-on in the overhead bin above row 14. I held onto my water bottle and my phone and nothing else. Row 27. I slid into the aisle seat. The woman with headphones didn't look up. The older man kept sleeping. I sat there for a moment trying to slow my pulse and convince myself I had not just done something ridiculous. The napkin was still folded in the pocket of my jeans. About 10 minutes passed. The flight attendant appeared from the front of the cabin. She walked back steadily, not rushing, not looking around in the obvious way you do when something is wrong. She stopped at my row and crouched down slightly so she was at eye level with me, and she said quietly, "Thank you. I need you to stay here." "Can you tell me what's happening?" I whispered. She looked at me for a moment. "There's a situation we're managing. We have it handled. I just needed you away from that seat." "Why that seat? Why me specifically?" She paused. Then she said, "The passenger next to you. We had a flag on him before boarding. I can't tell you more than that. But I needed to get you clear." A flag. Before boarding. Which meant this wasn't something she'd noticed mid-flight. This was something that had been known, or suspected, before any of us got on the plane. "Is everyone?" I started. "We're handling it," she said again, firm but not unkind. "The most helpful thing you can do right now is stay in the seat and stay calm." She stood up and walked forward again. I gripped my water bottle. Outside the window, 30,000 feet of nothing. The engine hum that you stop hearing after a while because your brain decides it's background, not signal. I don't know how long I sat there. It felt like a long time. It was probably 20 minutes. The flight continued on as though nothing was happening. The overhead screens showed the little plane icon inching across the map. People watched movies. A child a few rows up was asking repeated questions about whether we were there yet, the way children do. And then, from the front of the plane, there was movement. Not violent. Not the kind of thing you'd see in a movie. It was quieter than that, which somehow made it worse. 2 people in dark clothing who I hadn't noticed before. I don't know when they'd positioned themselves. I'd been staring at the seat back in front of me. Moved into the aisle near row 14. There was a brief exchange of words I couldn't hear. Some shifting. The man in 14B stood. He was escorted, calmly but with absolute firmness, toward the front of the plane. No shouting. No commotion. A few passengers nearby looked up and then looked away, the way people do on planes when they decide something isn't their business. The flight attendant appeared at my row again. She sat down in the empty seat beside me and exhaled once, a small, controlled exhale, and then looked at me. "You okay?" she asked. "I don't actually know," I said honestly. She almost smiled at that. "Fair answer. Who was he?" She shook her head slightly. "I can't tell you specifics. What I can tell you is that he was flagged by law enforcement before we boarded. There were federal air marshals on this flight. It was coordinated." "Then why?" I stopped. "Why move me, if it was already handled?" She looked at me steadily. "Because he'd been watching you since the gate. I noticed it while we were boarding. You were seated right next to him, and I didn't like what I was seeing." She paused. "Sometimes handled still has variables. I wanted you away from the variable." I didn't say anything for a moment. "He was watching me specifically? You were carrying your laptop bag into the gate area, and you stopped to answer a phone call. He stood nearby longer than made sense. Then he ended up in the seat right next to you." She shook her head. "Maybe coincidence. I didn't want to find out which. I thought about standing at the gate on my phone, my sister calling to ask what time I'd land, me standing there with my bag on my shoulder, not paying attention to anything around me. The carry-on," I said. "You said, leave it." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at me evenly. "Because if something had gone wrong and you needed to move fast, I didn't want you stopping for it." I held that for a second. There's a version of this where I say I handled it gracefully, where I nodded calmly and said something composed. That is not what happened. What happened is that my eyes went hot and I looked out the window for a moment because I was not going to cry on an airplane over something that hadn't even happened, and I took a breath and then another one. I almost didn't move, I said. I sat there for probably 5 minutes talking myself out of it. I know, she said. I was watching. What would you have done if I hadn't? Come back with a second reason to relocate you, she said. Spilled something. Asked you to help with something in the back. I would have gotten you out of that seat. I looked at her. You were going to make sure. Yes. I didn't know what to do with that, the certainty of it, that she had looked at a situation and decided, quietly and without making a scene, that she was going to make sure I was okay. Not because she had to. Because she'd noticed. I'm Laurel, I said, which was a strange thing to say at that moment, but felt necessary. Like I needed her to know I was a person with a name. I know, she said. It's on the manifest. A small pause. I'm Vivienne. We shook hands, there in row 27 at 30,000 feet, which was probably the most surreal handshake of my life. The rest of the flight passed quietly. I stayed in row 27. My carry-on stayed in the overhead bin at row 14, and I retrieved it after we landed. Hands slightly unsteady, laptop still inside and completely fine. A gate agent met us at the jetway. There were 2 men in suits near the door who didn't introduce themselves and who the flight attendant, Vivienne, spoke with briefly while the rest of us filed past. I waited until most people had gone ahead. When she came through, I touched her arm lightly. Thank you, I said. I mean it. She looked at me for a moment. Have a safe trip, she said. That was it. She went through the door. I went through the terminal. I found the baggage claim signs and followed them on autopilot, and I called my sister from the escalator, and when she answered, I just said, "Hey, I landed." And she said, "Oh good, I'm so glad." And I said, "Me too," and meant it about 7 different ways simultaneously. I didn't tell her what had happened on the phone. I told her in person that night, after the baby was asleep, and we were sitting at her kitchen table with mugs of tea and the particular exhausted quiet of a house with a newborn in it. She stared at me the whole time I told it, and when I finished, she said, "Laurel, oh my God." And I said, "I know." And she said, "You left your laptop?" We laughed at that for a long time. The kind of laughter that is really something else underneath. Relief, probably, or gratitude, or just the recognition that the world is stranger and more fragile and more full of quiet acts of care than you usually let yourself think about. I've flown a lot in my life, dozens of times, probably more. I've had delays and turbulence and middle seats and the full spectrum of airplane experiences from mundane to miserable. I've never once thought about the people working those flights as anything more than part of the infrastructure of travel, present, professional, background. I think about Vivienne now. I think about what it takes to notice. Not the dramatic noticing of movies, not the alarm-sounding obvious thing, but the quiet kind. The kind where you're doing your job, moving through a routine, and something small snags your attention, and instead of filing it away under probably nothing, you act on it. You write a note on a napkin. You watch to make sure the person reads it. You have a backup plan ready in case they don't. I don't know what would have happened if she hadn't. I genuinely don't. Maybe nothing. Maybe the federal air marshals had the whole situation completely contained, and I would have sat next to that man for 3.5 hours and landed in Portland and gone about my life none the wiser. That's possible, but she didn't know that for certain either. And she acted anyway. I looked up the airline's comment and feedback page when I got home. I wrote the longest submission I've ever written to a customer service portal in my life. I don't know if it reached her. I don't know how those things work. I hope it did. The baby's name is June. She has her father's ears and my sister's nose, and she smells the way all new babies smell, which is a thing I can't describe except to say that it makes you feel, for a moment, like the world is entirely okay. I held her for a long time that first night. My sister fell asleep on the couch beside me, and the house was quiet, and June made the small, uncoordinated movements that new babies make, and I sat there in the lamplight thinking about napkins and row numbers and a woman I'll probably never see again who decided, without being asked, to make sure I was okay. I thought a lot about what I would have done if I'd been her. If I'd seen something and had to make a call. Do I say something? Do I write something down? Do I risk being wrong? Do I risk the awkwardness if it turns out to be nothing? I'd like to think I would have written the note. I'm honestly not sure I would have. That's the thing that stays with me. Not the fear. Fear fades. It's designed to fade. What stays is the clarity of her choice. She saw something, she decided it mattered, and she did something about it. Small, quiet, effective. No announcement. No drama. Just a napkin and a pen and the willingness to act. I think about that on ordinary days now, when I'm moving through my routine and something small snags on the edge of my attention. A coworker who looks like she's having a hard time. A stranger at the grocery store who seems lost. The moments where you notice something and have to decide whether to do anything about it. I try to write the note. I've replayed that flight more times than I can count, not because I'm stuck in it. I'm not. But because something about it keeps asking to be understood more fully, like a sentence you read too fast the first time and have to go back to. What I keep coming back to isn't the fear. Fear is loud when it happens and then it fades, which is what it's supposed to do. What doesn't fade is the image of Vivienne writing that note. That quiet, deliberate act. She had no guarantee I would listen. She had no way to know whether I'd roll my eyes and assume it was a mistake. Which is almost exactly what I almost did. She acted anyway, with nothing but her own judgment and the willingness to be wrong in front of a stranger. That's the part that stays with me. The willingness to be wrong. Because here's what I think is actually hard in life. Not the big dramatic moments. Those are their own kind of simple. What's hard is the small one. The moment where you notice something and have to decide in real time whether to act on it or file it away under probably nothing and keep moving. Those moments don't announce themselves. They don't come with a signal telling you, this one matters. You just have to decide. Vivienne decided. And I've thought a lot about what that kind of decision requires. It requires paying attention first. Actually paying attention, not just being present while your mind is somewhere else. She noticed the man at the gate. She noticed how long he stood nearby. She noticed where he ended up seated. That's not luck. That's what happens when someone takes their own observations seriously instead of dismissing them. It also requires a kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It looks like writing a note on a napkin. It looks like crouching down in the aisle to check on a passenger. It looks like small, quiet, unremarkable action. But underneath it is a decision that says, I could be wrong, and I'm going to do this anyway, because if I'm right and I stay silent, I can't live with that. I think about that in my own life now. When I see a coworker struggling and I'm not sure if it's my place to say something. When I notice a friend going quiet in a way that feels different from her usual quiet. When something snags on the edge of my attention and my first instinct is to tell myself I'm reading too much into it. Maybe I'm reading too much into it sometimes. Maybe I say something and it turns out everything is fine and I feel a little awkward for a moment. That's the cost. That's the whole cost. And on the other side of it is the possibility that it mattered. What Vivienne did for me on that plane, she couldn't have known how it would land. She couldn't have known that I'd be sitting in my sister's kitchen that night holding a newborn named June, feeling the particular aliveness that comes after a close call you only half understand. She just did the thing she saw to do. That's what I want to carry forward, not some grand resolution, not a life philosophy I stitched together and framed. Just that one simple practice. When you notice something, take it seriously. When you see a way to help, do the small, quiet version of it. Be willing to be wrong. Act anyway. Vivienne didn't save my life in a dramatic way. She just made sure I was okay. And sometimes that's the whole thing.